Hi folks, welcome to the pre-meeting orientation video on the TAP and Perkins plan updates that you'll be hearing at your upcoming Workforce Board meeting on January 29th, 2020. I'm Eric Wolf, Deputy Director for Policy and Programs at the State Workforce Board. There's a lot of material to cover in this presentation, so we'll go ahead and jump on. What are we going to be asking of the board at this upcoming meeting? First and foremost, this is our opportunity to orient you to the first draft of the 2020 update of TAP. We'll be asking you to release that draft update for 30 days of public comment, which is required by the law. The way the timing works out, the public comment period will be closed roughly a week before your next regular meeting, which occurs in March. Per the board's charge in earlier meetings back in 2019 to stay the course on the TAP plan, the content edits to this 2020 update are relatively light. We will be, however, emphasizing some ways the goals have changed over time, and our partners will be on hand at the meeting in January to give you a little bit more detail on their respective sections of the plan and how they've evolved. We'll also be doing a deeper dive review of the Perkins 5 plan, which will also be presented to the board for the first time in a substantially complete draft form. You'll have an opportunity to offer guidance on the plan, specifically decision points that the law gives to the board as the state CTE board. And we'll be asking you as well to put the Perkins plan out for 30 days of public comment as part of TAP. Some of the decision points which we'll go into detail later in this orientation video include setting performance targets as a state under Perkins 5, reviewing different funding proposals and ways that we can leverage Perkins funds, given new flexibility under the Act. And we'll also be telling you a little bit about changes in the subrecipients who might access Perkins funds on the ground, most specifically an opportunity for tribal schools, tribal compact schools now, to receive an allocation of Perkins directly from OSPI. Finally, and we won't be going into detail on this in this video, but we'll be asking the board to finalize their guidance for the local plan submission process, which you considered for the first time and offered guidance on at your November meeting. So TAP has three major components, the first being a strategic chapter. For the purposes of your review, we did explicitly split TAP into three more digestible chunks, which you can download off of the agency website. The strategic portion of the plan encompasses an updated economic and workforce analysis. Our staff internally updated all the data and references from 2018 up to our most recent data to reflect an economic snapshot going into 2020. It also contains the narrative 4 chapters of TAP, each chapter respectively focusing in on a different strategic priority area of the board, which are integrating service delivery, strengthening business engagement, creating a next generation performance accountability system, and increasing access to services for all. And finally, that state strategy is detailed through the narrative that we'd submit in this portion of the plan. As a board member, your time is probably best spent preparing for this meeting by reading through this strategic portion of the TAP plan. It encompasses roughly 55 pages of text currently. It's a pretty quick 55-page read, though, given that much of the space is white space from margins, different subsections of the law. But this is really where the board expresses a vision for the system going forward. That vision is reflected in some of the goals that are underneath each of the 4 priority areas. The 4 priority areas have anywhere between 2 and 6 explicit goals for the system to track and monitor over implementation. Those goals have changed slightly over time based off of conversations we've had with the Workforce Board, and we wanted you to be aware of explicit changes to goals that will be submitted as part of this 2020 update pending your review and approval. There has been a change in the conversation on navigators and the concept of navigational support and integrating service delivery. We are proposing as staff new wording for this goal, reflecting some feedback that we've received from the Washington Workforce Association, we thought was spot on given the conversation that the board has had on this navigation concept. The new goal that we're putting out for the board to consider is that the system will work to improve Washington's workforce system staff capabilities to navigate customers to the resources they need to advance on individual career pathways. Instead of creating an explicit job class of navigators, we're moving more to creating the capability and the expertise among all system staff to move comfortably across the different program silos when it's appropriate to help support participants in our system. The next goal change is on business engagement. We've moved away as a system from setting an explicit number of staff to train on sector partnerships, and it's become a much more general goal about training workforce system staff on business engagement and business engagement techniques. And finally, we've discussed this at length. One of the goals that was completely implemented during the first iteration of TAP was the implementation of universal wireless internet access in comprehensive one-stop centers or workforce centers around Washington State. That goal was accomplished in the previous implementation cycle, so we've removed all references to that as a technology and access priority in the plan. The second section of TAP that you should be aware of is the operational chapters of the plan. The operational chapters of the plan identify exactly how each partner in the plan will work to achieve the strategic vision and goals expressed in the strategic portion of the plan. So in this section, you will see generally two types of written responses. The first questions that were asked as a system go to what are the actual legal and guidance underpinnings that we offer to folks on the ground who are actually providing workforce services. This includes different system operating procedures and policies, different assurances that our partners are required to make to the federal government in terms of just operating these services. And then the second category of written content you'll find in this section has to do with how each partner program will explicitly change or align their service delivery in order to meet the strategic vision and goals within the plan. What you will see is for several questions in this operational chapter, there will be an overarching question posed for each partner program to describe how they will align to, say, serve job seekers or serve businesses, or how they will align in order to meet the needs of the different special populations within WIOA. In the case of these questions that invite an individual response from each of our partners, partners have drafted individual responses and have been working to update those if appropriate or if necessary for this update. Finally, the third part of TAP, and by volume the largest part of the plan, are all the appendices at the back of the plan that encompass the full operating plans of each of TAP's combined plan parts. And here's a list of the different operating plans that are encompassed and attached to TAP, all of which do get submitted as part of the TAP submission and approval process on the same federal portal. We've worked with partners over the last several months to update their respective sections of the plan, not only to accomplish data updates for timeliness as appropriate, but also to do some massaging of narrative to reflect programs that either have wound down over the last several years or to add in different programs or strategies that have come online recently. Encompassed in these partner plan portions are the WIOA core titles, which are the four at the top of this list, as well as the required federal partners under WIOA. I will say you will not see plans for Community Development Block Grant or Community Services Block Grant. These commerce programs are exempted from having to include full operating plans as part of the state workforce plan. Nonetheless, they're still required to write to how they align to TAP overall, and they have done so within this submission. So we'll move on from TAP and jump into what's new with Perkins 5, with an eye towards giving you background for the upcoming board meeting and the discussions that you will be having there. First, I wanted to reorient your attention to the Perkins 5 mission, vision, and values conversation that we had over the past 2 board meetings or so. The board has already seen this mission, vision, and values that was drafted by our Perkins team and has approved it. We wanted to make sure that you were aware of it again, though, because we think it aligns really beautifully with TAP and is a great launching off point as we think about all the other decisions that are being proposed for Perkins 5. First and foremost, with Perkins 5, there's an incredibly strong emphasis on continuous improvement in performance among student subpopulations and really causing states, local school districts, and the colleges that receive Perkins money to become intentional about moving the needle for different vulnerable populations in the community. The way that the law really emphasizes that is by requiring data to be disaggregated by different student subpopulations for each of our performance indicators. It asks each of the partners involved with administering Perkins to craft specific equity strategies and create performance improvement plans when performance is not improving among different subpopulations. It reemphasizes a critical aspect of Perkins historically called methods of administration, which basically authorizes our Perkins partner programs to work with school districts and colleges to ensure the physical accessibility of spaces where CTE is offered. And finally, equity is a critical focus area in the comprehensive local needs assessment process that's been designed by partners to accompany this plan. In fact, turning to our comprehensive local needs assessments, which we have discussed in several previous board meetings, improving equity and access is the very top element, the first element that all recipients of Perkins grant money will be required to write to each time they apply for a portion of this grant. These comprehensive local needs assessments are going to be a standardized template used both by school districts and the colleges that apply for Perkins money. So we'll be collecting basically the same information from both components of the CTE system, which is a really great thing. Other areas of emphasis in the comprehensive local needs assessment that applicants will be required to write to include an annual evaluation of their performance on the different target indicators, an annual evaluation of how their CTE programs align not only among the secondary to post-secondary system, whether there's alignment among those two systems, but also how their program offerings align to the economic need in the community and to different economic development imperatives locally. They'll also be looking at the size, quality, and scope of their program offerings and giving us some feedback at the state level about how they're curating their program offerings over time. They'll also look at how their programs have been implemented and do an analysis of the availability of programs of study. And finally, they'll also be writing to their different recruitment, retention, and training strategies for CTE educators. A real critical aspect of the comprehensive local needs assessment process is that the law and all of our guidance that accompanies this process very explicitly emphasizes engaging stakeholders in your community. The comprehensive local needs assessments that will be completed by each program applicant will require a signature page that asks each applicant to go out and do stakeholder engagement with local economic development authorities, businesses in the area, local workforce development councils in the area, etc. Finally, Perkins Partners came together and developed a really great set of comprehensive resources to help support this process, which we will be socializing along with the template. That includes a draft comprehensive local needs assessment resource guide that is applicable to both the community and technical college system and to our K-12 school districts. We've also developed a county-by-county contact directory of stakeholders that the law requires engagement with, so that every school district and every college can at least do a county-by-county inventory of what stakeholders they need to be approaching as they develop their plan and undertake their comprehensive local needs assessment. And finally, we also have the innovation or the workforce information dashboard, which we've prototyped with the board. We've designed this to be right off of the launch, useful in the CLNA process to provide some really good economic snapshot information locally that CTE directors and colleges would find useful as they think about programs of study and alignment with different economic development priorities in their local area. One of the key differences between Perkins 4 and the new Perkins 5 are that we as a state have the ability to set our own performance targets. In the law, there are different performance indicators which are proscribed by law. At the secondary level, there are 10 indicators that the law says we must measure as a state. But Perkins 5 allows us as a state to set our own proposed targets. In previous years and in previous iterations of the law, every year the Workforce Board would lead a negotiation process between the Federal Department of Education and our Perkins team here in Washington on what targets should look like in the coming year. Now the role of the federal government in actually setting those targets is greatly reduced. In exchange, we as a state have the authority to set performance targets for ourselves, provided they are vetted with stakeholders that are specified in the law. In the performance section of the draft Perkins 5 plan of your packet, there are excellent appendices that have been prepared by both our secondary and our post-secondary system partners that explain the methodology that went into proposing these targets and also outline in detail the stakeholder engagement that went into creating these proposed targets with each part of their respective system. I encourage you to do like a Control F in the board document to try or to find those appendices on performance targets if you're interested in doing a deep dive on the methodology. For your reference, though, these are the targets that have been proposed for the secondary system. It is important to note that Perkins 5, at least for our secondary partners, has a lot of overlap in the indicators that we have already been measuring for many years under Perkins 4. So for many of these secondary level performance indicators, we have years worth of baseline data under Perkins 4 from which we can project these proposed targets. One that I do want to highlight for your attention is the 5S1, S2, and S3 measure, the 3 rows on the bottom. Secondary CTE is asked to measure program quality, and we are given an option as a state to choose how we want to measure program quality. We can either measure it by measuring the number of folks that attain recognized post-secondary credentials within a year after leaving their CTE program, or by those that attain sheer post-secondary credit. Or a third measure is work-based learning. It says there are 3 options here. We have very recently refined this down to 2 potential options for how we might measure and catalog the people who are on our secondary CTE systems who are receiving work-based learning. In a moment, I'll go into how we've aligned that with Career Connect Washington as well. Turning to our post-secondary partners, our post-secondary partners are responsible for 3 performance indicators under the federal law. Again, though, we have full authority as a state to set our own proposed targets for each of those indicators, which are listed out here. We have had experience with these indicators in the past, so we were building them off of previous year's baselines under Perkins 4. I do want to point out an indicator that we as a state have spent a lot of time and effort thinking about over the last several years. In the post-secondary performance indicators, it's expressed as 3P1. On the previous slide, you would have seen this as 4S1, non-traditional program enrollment. Under Perkins 5, states are measured based on how many non-traditional students they have enrolled into programs of study that are non-traditional for their gender. A non-traditional student in Washington is only gender-based under the law. For instance, we get credit for programs that place women into welding programs of study, or programs that place men into non-traditional male fields such as nursing. We as a state have been working on this for many, many years. At the federal level, there has been conversation about redefining non-trad, but for Perkins 5, we're still in a situation that we understood and that we've been working with since Perkins 4, which is non-trad means only gender-based and gender-based careers. There is a little bit of an outstanding question that we as partners are still puzzling out together, and that we are still working with the feds to obtain better guidance on. Recently, Washington State changed state law to allow students to choose gender X instead of a binary gender choice. We do have students that report themselves as gender X in our systems. How do we factor them in, not only to the overall data that we collect, but how do they factor into the non-traditional conversation? More to come. Partners work together to make sure that our Perkins 5 plan aligns to the ongoing Career Connect Washington initiative. We're really lucky to have Career Connect and the energy that it's sparked here in Washington State. We want to highlight in particular the leadership priorities that you're going to see in a few slides for the coming year. Our partners have developed with an eye towards really expanding access to high-quality CTE, high-quality work-based learning opportunities. Perkins 5 emphasizes repeatedly that states should really be investing in creating work-based learning opportunities for youth. We're lucky that we already have a framework in place here in Washington to do that, that all of our systems are engaged in building and scaling up. As I mentioned in a previous slide, at the secondary level, we're now also asked to measure program quality. And one way in which we can do that is by measuring the rate at which our programs offer work-based learning opportunities for young people. I mentioned that we had 2 developed options for tracking and modeling work-based learning opportunities for young people. There are slightly different variations, and it's fairly ticky-tack on how they differ, but one thing that I think is important to emphasize is that both of the ways we might track and model work-based learning incorporate and give credit to both career prep and career launch experiences as defined under Career Connect Washington. I've thrown up this continuum, this framework that Career Connect Washington sets up for different career opportunities that they are measuring. To give you a brief reminder of what explore versus prep versus launch means, career exploration is meant to occur usually earlier in the educational process, and it's really about giving young people some exposure to the variety, depth, and breadth of career opportunities available in Washington. Career prep encompasses internships. It might encompass work-based learning opportunities as well. Where that career prep begins to rise to the level of career launch is when those work-based learning opportunities are both paid and also lead to some sort of credit or credential. which young people will gain as a result of also undertaking that work-based learning. Let's turn now to an overview of how Perkins 5 money is split into different categories and the different uses of those categories. This conversation is going to feed directly into the bulk of the conversation at your upcoming board meeting, which involves several decision points on how money is allocated to push forward the different goals and strategies we set forth in the plan. You may remember this graph from last year. We presented this image in roughly March or April of 2019 at a board meeting as an illustration of how the different components of the Perkins budget operate. I'm going to walk you through each of these different categories and let you know how they work together, and we will also highlight where decision points are available to the board at this meeting and in future years. I will also propose to you a different set of questions for the board that we will be talking through at our board meeting next week, and that I hope you do a little bit of pre-thinking about before we go into that meeting. To refresh your memory, Perkins federal funds are split into three overarching categories. The first being that blue category, basic grant funds. The second being the red category, state leadership funds. The third, that green category, administrative funds. Of the entire pot of Perkins money, 85% go into basic grant annually. Up to 10% of the money goes into leadership. If you go less than that 10%, you can convert it over into basic grant money. And then finally, 5% of it is carved off the top to support administration of the Perkins grant at the state level. Our first and most important overarching discussion to have with the board at this meeting is that the Perkins Plan partners would like the board to charge a Perkins funding work group to convene through August 2020 of this year, analyze the different decision points involved with Perkins funding, and do projections and modeling so that we can responsibly make recommendations to the board in future years about how either to adjust basic grant splits or to better and more strategically align the uses of some of the quote-unquote discretionary funds under this act, the leadership and the admin funds. That Perkins funding work group will create different business rules and rationale for recommending to the board year over year how to split the basic grant money between the secondary system and the post-secondary system. And also some business rules on how we might make adjustments to that split in the future. Beyond the basic grant funds, which are non-discretionary, there are also that leadership and admin pools. And there is some discretion to what is called the reserve portion of the basic grant. We would ask this work group to go away and also come up with annual recommendations for the board on how to achieve strategic alignment and how the state invests those funds, and then report back to the board on how that goes year over year. We do have some questions for the board to consider that we would like you to think about. First of all, is this funding work group proposal acceptable to the board members? Taking this outside the 6 or so board meetings each year, but coming back and reporting to the board and having that periodic conversation, will that work for board members? Secondly, are there other stakeholders that the funding group should be engaging as they develop recommendations for the board to consider? Third, what factors would be important for board members to know or consider before they jump into future funding conversations? So we'll go ahead and we'll zoom in now on basic grant and some of the different decision points that are involved there. Basic grant is this category off on the left. I should note that all of the dollar amounts in here referred to the year that we are currently in, which is the Perkins 5 transition year. We do have numbers for next year. They are slightly higher. All the math still works this way, but the numbers are different. So I will say take the numbers with a grain of salt. They're pretty close by sheer dollar amount. but they are slightly different as we project out the program year beginning July 1st, 2020, and they're slightly higher, which is great. So first zooming in on basic grant here off on the left-hand side of the page, 85% of the total state allocation each year goes to basic grant. Since roughly the early 1990s, there's been a negotiated agreement to send 56% of the basic grant to our post-secondary system partners and 44% to our secondary system partners. So of that 18.4 million number under that basic grant box gets split 56-44 post-secondary, secondary, respectively. For the program year beginning July 2020 and continuing until June 2021, Perkins Plan partners are recommending that the board maintain this 56-44% split that we have historically leaned on. And then the Perkins Funding Work Group will develop business rules and recommendations for adjusting the split in future years. One thing to be apprised of, though, as board members, the local program money that goes out to school districts and to community and technical colleges has a potentially wider universe of applicants that can access the money. Perkins 5 is really quite direct in that it allows tribal compact schools or schools operated by the sovereign tribal Indian nations across Washington state that have an agreement with local school districts to access Perkins money. We also do believe that there is an opportunity at the post-secondary level rather, for different and new partnerships with tribes, which we're still exploring. We do anticipate that roughly a half dozen new tribal compact schools will receive Perkins basic grant money at the secondary level. So these are new applicants that have not accessed the funds through OSPI in the past. They will be able to receive a portion of Perkins basic grant in the coming year. Another part of the basic reserve funds that you need to be aware of is this so-called basic grant reserve. Of the 85% total state allocation that goes out to basic grant, states may elect to hold part of that as a reserve. Under previous versions of the law, states could hold up to 10% of the 85% basic grant allocation in reserve. Under Perkins 5, states may elect instead to hold up to 15% in reserve. That's an increase from 10% up to 15% in reserve. For the time being, Perkins Plan partners are recommending that we maintain our historical 10% set aside for the current year, but that the Perkins Funding Work Group will come back to the board with some modeling and a recommendation on whether the reserve rate should either be maintained at 10% in future years or increased up to 15%, or somewhere between the 10 and 15%, along with a rationale for doing so. Think about this reserve funding question, though. This is an area where the board does have decision-making authority. Some questions for the board to consider as we go into our conversations on Tuesday. What would be useful for everybody to know as we think about holding up to 15%, going from 10 to 15 of the grant money in reserve in order to use strategically? And what information or data would you like from partners in order to inform your guidance on how we might prioritize reserve funding in the future? Historically, reserve funds have been used to either help rural school districts and rural colleges address gaps, or in the post-secondary system, there is a portion of the reserve that is also held aside to help schools that have very large CTE enrollments similarly address gaps when necessary. So Perkins also sets aside a special category of discretionary money called leadership money. States may not spend more than 10% of their award on state leadership activities, It isn't up to. Perkins Partners are recommending that we do spend up to that 10% allocation in a discretionary manner. However, there are some ways in the law that we have to spend leadership funds, which are prescribed in the law. In previous years, we've used the model that's displayed on the screen in front of you. 1% of the state allocation, or 1/10 of the leadership, would go into supporting state institutions. What that functionally means is CTE implementation in corrections institutions, juvenile rehabilitation institutions. There was also in the past an explicit set-aside that gets carved out so that we can address gaps in non-traditional student enrollment. We discussed non-traditional students previously. There's a new carve-out in Perkins 5, which we encountered for the first time last year during the transition year. It's a very, very minuscule carve-out that's set aside for recruiting non-traditional students into CTE. We're recommending that we just maintain that sort of minimum threshold carve-out for the time being. And then finally, whatever remains after you've carved out the state institution set aside and the non-trad set aside, everything else that remains has extremely flexible uses in the. So what are the specific recommendations you're going to be hearing at the board meeting coming from Perkins Partners on how leadership funds are used? Let's talk about that correctional institutions allocation first. We are still maintaining a 1% set aside to serve individuals in correctional institutions. However, SBCTC and OSPI have negotiated and would like to ask to set the split a little bit differently. Instead of being split evenly among the two different components of our system, our partners feel it's more fair to split 85% of the money to SBCTC and 15% of it to OSPI. That reflects the fact that SBCTC serves vastly more individuals in correctional institutions and juvenile justice facilities than OSPI does in the secondary space. This is much more reflective of their actual workload from one system to the other. A second thing that we'd like the board to be aware of and be prepared to discuss and offer some guidance on is that partners are recommending that we move away from setting the maximum set aside for non-traditional student enrollment, which has been $150,000, and instead set aside $60,000, which would be split 50-50 between OSPI and SBCTC. The remaining $90,000 that in the past would have been set aside for non-traditional students would instead roll into the broader discretionary leadership category, and that $90,000 would be prioritized to increase enrollment and performance for all members of special population groups instead of merely non-traditional. Partners are recommending this so that an intentional investment can be made towards increasing performance in all underrepresented populations here, as opposed to just the non-traditional gender-based restriction that we're normally tied to. We felt that this was much more embracive of Perkins 5 mandate to move the needle for the different student subpopulations and more in alignment with the spirit of the law. So what about the pool of all other leadership money, which is discretionary and flexible? Our partners have come together to create a list of recommended priorities for how that money will be spent in the coming year. Those priorities are laid out in front of you here. We will have a handout for you on the day of that gives you more context on what each of these priorities entails. I do want to highlight we're very excited about, especially the top priority identified by the systems was using these leadership funds to adapt our existing program offerings to really embrace the challenge of the future of work, of ensuring that we're being responsive to advances in AI and automation, etc. So you will see that at your upcoming meeting. The questions for the board that we would like you to think about and consider going forward include: does the board have questions on how leadership funds will be spent in the coming year before you're asked to finalize these recommendations at the March meeting? Specifically, the new ways that partners are advocating for how we spend leadership funds. Secondly, are there any specific priorities you'd like the funding group to take into account in future years as they develop leadership money recommendations for the board? Third, what information or data would be useful for us to collect for the board to further refine system priorities for leadership funding? Finally, the third type of Perkins fund is the administration monies. Perkins includes a 5% set aside for states to administer the law at the state level. The catch, though, is that for every dollar that we set aside as a state to administer the law, we have to match that federal money with non-federal money, basically state funds that either we at the Workforce Board are using or our partners at OSPI or SPCTC can match administratively. Over the past decade, the board lost an explicit appropriation from our state legislature to meet this match requirement. We used to get general fund money for the explicit purpose of being able to make the one-to-one match here. That went away during the last recession cycle. And since the Workforce Board locally receives a relatively small appropriation of state money to go into our budget, it's a small component of our operating budget, which is a mixture of state funds and also federal money. We have historically really had difficulty over the past few years meeting the state money match requirement to the federal funds. Because of this, we've been put in a difficult situation where we've either had to move money around or give administration money to our partners at OSPI and SPCTC to convert to basic grant. Nonetheless, the administrative responsibilities of Perkins remain, even in the event we're unable to identify match funding, we have to offload it or recharacterize it in some way. So it does place a particularly strain on our ability to leverage state funds, which are typically more flexible than federal funds in the event that we're unable to identify a match. We want, because it does raise a couple questions for the board to consider this year and in future years. Specifically, we want to start a conversation about the board's interest in combining powers to try and restore that admin match appropriation from the legislature. And moreover, because admin and leadership do have some discretionary ways that they might be used, how much more information would the board like to detail how we've historically used these funds so that you can feel like you're in a good position to make adjustments in future years that are more strategic? So with that, I'll just say thank you very much for taking the time and energy to review the video and the materials for this meeting. It is going to be a very interesting and substantive conversation. We welcome your questions and feedback. Please shoot me an email directly and I will correspond with you to address any of your concerns. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend.